So of course the story was created originally by Lewis Carroll. So that was actually his pen name. His actual name was Charles Lutheridge Dodson. So he was an author, a poet, and a mathematician. And it's likely that he named the story of Alice in Wonderland after a certain Alice Liddell. Now, Alice Liddell is a very small girl, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth here. But the thing is, it's Lewis had a bit of an obsession with young girls, in particular taking pictures of very young girls. And so one day he was very close to like the Liddell family, and they went out on a picnic, and Alice kind of insisted on him retelling a story which he told to her many times before, right? So on this picnic, this is where at the end of the story she convinces him to actually write down the story. So many months later, he kind of like drags his feet, but many months later, he finally gets around to actually writing the story. And so this was in 1862 where this little picnic happened, right? In 1863, Lewis Carroll and the Liddell family kind of drift apart. And the Liddell family don't actually give a reason for why they drifted apart. And it's a thing where Lewis Carroll kind of then went on to deny that Alice was based on any sort of girl. There's there's no Alice. There's no, it's not based off anyone at all. But more likely than not, what it was that at age 11, he proposes to her. So we'll talk about that a little bit later and stuff, right? But that's probably why the family and him kind of like drifted apart. But anyway, in spite of the kind of very dark history regarding all of that, the story of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and the sequel Through the Looking Glass were very, very successful. And so, of course, Walt Disney, when he was growing up, he was very much influenced by the different stories. And so from a very young age, he wanted to make films about this, right? But in terms of the creative process that went into this, it's a thing where what he wanted to do was to keep the story as close to the original as possible, because a lot of the kind of humor, a lot of the kind of gags already within the thing. So there's no need for writers to kind of like add extra little jokes in, because like the whole story is quite humorous in and of itself. So while there weren't any add-ins, there were actually some omissions. So the reason for that obviously is for pacing purposes. And this is because Walt Disney wanted to make something which would be accessible for children and didn't want it to go on for far, far too long. So he cut out a lot of stories. So for instance, the stories that he cut out were that of the Jabberwock, the story of the Duchess, the story of the Mock Turtle, the Griffin, and also the White Knight. Now, what's interesting about the White Knight is that within the original script for this, the White Knight was going to be modelled off of Walt Disney himself. And it was decided for once, rare time in Walt Disney life, he decided that the female character was actually going to be genuinely empowered, right? So, as we said in other videos as well, like when we talk about Cinderella, for instance, she ends up having ex machinas from other things, right? But in this, it's decided that instead of a White Knight coming to save her, that she would figure it out by herself. And this is where the song Very Good Advice comes from, right? So instead of there being a White Knight to save her, this is where she kind of goes and figures it out for herself. So that explains kind of the story of the kind of like creative process that went into it. But now we have to talk about the story of the studio. So Alice in Wonderland for Disney end up kind of being a bit of a cursed film. Now, what I mean by that is all the way back in 1923, when he was doing Laugh-O-Grams, he made Alice in Wonderland. So we spoke about this in previous videos before. So he made that then. And the problem was that Laugh-O-Grams ended up going bankrupt in 1923. So the film ended up being finished, but it never actually got released to the general public. So he was convinced that he was going to make the film in 1933. However, he got put off because Paramount at that time wanted to do a live action version of it, right? So the film ended up being scrapped for a while up until 1936, where he decided he was going to have a Mickey Mouse do this. So this is like a little 8-minute cartoon, and it's Mickey Mouse basically kind of doing like the story of Alice in Wonderland. And then in 1938, based on the success of Snow White, which obviously came out the year before, Disney now had a lot of money, right? And so what he did with some of that money is he went and bought up the rights for Alice in Wonderland. And so in 1939, he got David Hall to do the storyboard, and he got Al Perkins to do the story reel. I may have got the two things confused, but Al Perkins is the writer and David Hall is the illustrator, right? He's the animator. So the problem with the one that they were working on in 1939 is that Disney didn't really like David Hall's illustrations because it looked far too much like the original illustrations within the books. And on top of that, with regard to Al Perkins, he found that the storyline was just a bit too dark. So work on this kind of got paused for a little bit. And as we've said in our videos as well, the early 1940s had a lot of issues for Disney. We won't go into it now. Check out our other videos. We spoke about it ad nauseum. So just check those other videos out if you want more like a juicy gossip about all the things that's going on. But anyway, after World War II, Disney hired Aldous Huxley, as this is the author of A Brave New World. He got him to rewrite the script. However, what he found with Huxley's version was that it stuck far too close to the original, and so this ended up being changed again. And also another thing that ended up being changed is the fact that, originally they wanted it to be a live action film, and this is actually going to have Luana Patton, who was in A Song of the South, and it was also going to have Lisa Davis, who would later be in 101 Dalmatians. So they wanted it to be live action. However, Disney kind of realized that in order for the film to be made and to do it real justice to the actual story, the whole thing would have to be animated. So this is where they made a shift from it being a focus on live action to it being a shift focusing on animation. Now, like we said for the Pinocchio video, all the way back in 1940, you can see in the opening scene for that, you see that the Disney studios were working on ideas for Peter Pan and for Alice in Wonderland. So fast forward now to 1948, and this is where, like we said in the last video, there was a race on between Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan. So Cinderella ended up winning in that race, Alice in Wonderland came second and Peter Pan came third. However, in 1949, you end up having an Anglo-French film of Alice in Wonderland, and this was going to be with stop-motion puppets who were going to be animated. And Disney used his power and his influence to basically do a bit of protectionism. So what he did is he sued the film to make sure that it couldn't be shown in American cinemas, right? So this obviously gave him an unfair advantage, and that they knew that they were working on Alice in Wonderland stuff, right? So before it even came out, they kind of disadvantaged this Anglo-French film, So yeah, there's a bit of like shadiness, but anyway. So that kind of talks about the story of the studio, and now we're going to talk about the casting that they had for the film. So with regards to the casting for this, there end up being a lot of people. We don't have time to go into every single person, but we will kind of run through a bit of a list now. So in terms of the voice of Alice, this is Catherine Beaumont, and she would later be in Peter Pan. You had Ed Wynn, and he was the voice of the Mad Hatter, and who would later be in Mary Poppins. This is the voice of Uncle Albert. For the Caterpillar, you had Richard Haydn, and he would later be in The Sound of Music. For Sterling Holloway, who plays the Cheshire Cat, and for Verna Felton, who plays the Queen of Hearts, both of them we've covered in more detail with regard to the Dumbo video. Definitely check that out for more of a kind of list of like what all the films that they were both in. And then you have Pat O'Malley, who's the voice of Tweedledee and Tweedledum. He's in 101 Dalmatians, he's in Mary Poppins, he's in Jungle Book, and he's also in Robin Hood. You had Bill Thompson, who's the voice of the White Rabbit. So he's in Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp, Sleeping Beauty, Aristocats, and also he is the voice of Droopy. So when you hear the voice of Droopy, that is actually the voice of the White Rabbit in Alice in Wonderland. Then also as well, like we said in the last video, talking about Cinderella, you had Jimmy MacDonald, who plays the Dormouse, and you had Lucille Bliss, who plays the Daisies and the Tulips, and both of these were in Cinderella and other things as well. But check those two videos out for more kind of details on what they did. So, of course, they had many more people within the cast than this, but these are just an idea of the main ones, right? So that kind of concludes the story of the studio, and now we're going to talk about the themes and the history. So talking about the themes and the history, some people have kind of overanalyzed Alice in Wonderland, yeah. You tend to get this a lot with kind of like English literature students and with like English teachers and stuff, people reading all kinds of weird meanings into things. The kind of symbolism within it, you're doing too much, right? Just chill, yeah. You're thinking far too deeply about it. it doesn't represent all these. It's just nonsense, right? What it is meant to just be nonsense. It's meant to be full of puns. It's meant to be kind of just silliness, right? That's the whole point of why he made it. And it wasn't influenced by drugs. There's no evidence that it was influenced by drugs. Lewis Carroll, he may have taken some sort of opiate, but it wouldn't cause you to have trips like this. LSD hadn't been invented till the 60s. More likely than not, there's no evidence that he took any magic mushrooms. So it's not influenced by drugs. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But the association with drugs comes almost a century later with the hippie movement. We'll talk about that in more depth. What it's actually about, and there's nothing to see here. What it's actually about is just the story of a 30-year-old man trying to win the affections of a 10/11-year-old. So nothing to see here. Oh my god, it's so weird. But the point is that when we look at like the themes in the history, we obviously, like we said before, everything is it's a moment of history. Yeah, like kind of it's a piece of history, right? So when you look at a book, when you look at a film, it's a part of a historic process. So Lewis Carroll, rather than the Liddell family calling the police on him, they kind of just stopped him from seeing Alice Liddell. And the reason for that is because in England at the time, the age of consent was just 12 years old. And it would stay that way all the way until 1875. So from 1275 all the way till 1875, age consent in England was 12. And in 1875, they raised it to the ripe old age of 13. Yeah, 13. And it wasn't until 1885 that it became 16. And actually, just as a bit of trivia, in 1917, so during the war, there was talk of them raising it from 16 to 17, and it lost in the Commons by just one vote. That's just a bit of trivia, but it gives you an idea of the reason why no one called the police on him, as would happen nowadays if a 30-year-old tried to propose to an 11-year-old. That's because of that. So the whole reason why he wrote the story, the whole reason why he made the story up, was to impress Alice Liddell. So yeah, so it's parking the very kind of dark origins of the story. It still had quite a great legacy, right? Although the legacy of this film was very much a mixed bag.